In the gilded halls of Queen Isabella's palace, power is never granted lightly, and attention can be as deadly as a dagger. Behind every silk gown, every whispered compliment, and every carefully orchestrated smile lies ambition, envy, and peril. One man, Lorenzo di Falco, rises as the Queen's golden favorite, admired, envied, and ensnared by obsession that is both intoxicating and suffocating. Every glance, every favor, every shadowed corridor carries a lesson in survival, and the walls themselves seem to watch. In a world where influence is currency and obedience a weapon, the line between triumph and ruin is razor thin. This is a story of desire, danger, and the chilling cost of favor. The corridors of the palace never slept. Even as midnight draped its velvet cloak over the city, soft footfalls echoed through gilded halls, whispers clinging to tapestries, curling around marble columns, candles flickered, shadows danced, and the court, as always, held its breath. In the year 1587, the court of Queen Isabella was a theater of delicate treacheries, and every gesture, every smile, could be the difference between favor or ruin. He was called Lorenzo di Falco, a man whose presence commanded both admiration and suspicion. Handsome, poised, and cunning beyond his years, he had been the Queen's confidant for nearly a decade. Nobles whispered that no other could rival him in charm, intelligence, or the quiet authority with which he navigated the labyrinth of palace politics. Isabella had lifted him from obscurity, placed him in the very chamber of her trust, and for a time, Lorenzo thrived. He walked as though the world bent to his step, and the Queen's favor made him untouchable, or so it seemed. But palaces are fragile kingdoms of intrigue, and favor, as all courtiers know, is a candle flickering in a gusting wind. The court watched Lorenzo with the same breathless fascination as a spider watches a struggling fly. Servants, eunuchs, and ladies-in-waiting alike whispered of his influence, of the quiet authority he held over decisions large and small. Some spoke in envy, others in fear. Few understood that power in Isabella's court came with an unspoken price. The Queen herself, a woman of iron wrapped in velvet, ruled with precision and intuition. Her mind was a blade, sharp and unyielding, and her pleasures were never casual. She did not suffer fools, nor those whose loyalty could waver. Lorenzo, for all his brilliance, had believed that years of obedience and clever counsel had granted him a permanent place beside her. He misread the subtle currents that shifted like tides beneath Isabella's gaze. It began with small tests, almost imperceptible. A favor requested one day, withdrawn the next. A smile that once carried warmth, now edged with frost. The courtiers whispered. The Queen's temper turned swiftly, and no man, however favored, is immune. Lorenzo laughed off the rumors. He had survived more cunning rivals, navigated traps that would have undone lesser men, and always emerged with his position intact. Yet Isabella's court was a place where history had taught even the strongest men to tremble. One night, as the moon cast silver light across the palace gardens, Lorenzo found himself summoned to the Queen's private chamber. The corridor seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls themselves feared what was to come. He approached the grand oaken doors, polished and carved with the Queen's emblem, feeling the first real tremor of unease. In that moment, he understood the truth that had eluded him in years of service. The closer one was to power, the sharper the blade that could strike you. Inside, Isabella awaited, seated with her usual composure. Her dark eyes, luminous and unyielding, studied him with the precision of a surgeon. The air between them was thick with expectation. 1,000 courtiers could not have prepared Lorenzo for the command that would follow. The Queen had grown weary of his influence, his independence, his very presence that reminded her of the fragile boundary between favor and subjugation. He had been her favorite, the brightest star in her court, but even stars can fall. As she spoke, the words cut deeper than any sword. They were a promise, a decree, and a judgment all at once. Lorenzo, for the first time, realized the true cost of intimacy with a monarch whose whims could shift like lightning. Absolute obedience was no longer sufficient. The whispers that had haunted the palace corridors all these years were no longer idle chatter. They were warnings, omens of a fate he had yet to fully comprehend. By the time he left the chamber, the echo of Isabella's voice lingered like smoke in his mind. The court continued its restless rhythm, unaware of the change that had occurred within the walls of that private room. Lorenzo's walk was measured, his face calm, but beneath the practiced exterior, fear had taken root. The palace, which had once been his stage, now felt like a cage. Shadows stretched longer, whispers sharpened, and the court, patient and relentless, waited. For in Isabella's realm, favor was a fleeting illusion, and Lorenzo would soon learn that the price of being the queen's favorite could be more horrifying than any exile, imprisonment, or death. Favor in a royal court was currency more lethal than any dagger, and Lorenzo di Falco knew this truth better than most. To bask in Queen Isabella's attention was to walk a corridor lined with gold and concealed snares, every step echoing both privilege and peril. The queen's favor illuminated his position in the court, yet it cast shadows of envy, suspicion, and inevitable doom. Every whispered command, every private smile, carried weight far heavier than its appearance. One misstep, one delayed gesture, could topple him from the pinnacle of influence to the depths of disgrace. Lorenzo had earned Isabella's trust not through birthright, but by the precision of his mind. His intelligence was sharp, his wit agile, and his discretion absolute. He understood the delicate alchemy of obedience and insight, of speaking with authority, yet never betraying ambition. The queen, whose gaze was both calculating and merciless, saw in him a rare combination of talent and subservience. He became indispensable, an extension of her will, capable of navigating the labyrinthine politics of the palace, while leaving rivals disoriented in his wake. To be her favored was not merely privilege, it was a tool, a weapon, and a tether. The palace itself was a theater of authority. Marble corridors, gilded ceilings, and tapestries depicting victories and dynasties hid the machinations of power. Advisors whispered plots behind embroidered screens. Chambermaids carried messages meant for their ears alone. Eunuchs trailed silently, noting each expression and gesture. Lorenzo's golden favor shielded him from most of these dangers, but he sensed the subtle glances of jealousy and malice that never ceased. He was exalted, yes, but exposed a target draped in brilliance. Privileges followed him as naturally as shadow follows light. He dined beside the queen, attended councils meant only for the inner circle, and received letters of intelligence that shaped policy across kingdoms. Foreign ambassadors courted him with gifts of rare silks and jewels, recognizing that his proximity to the queen was power incarnate. To an outsider, he seemed untouchable, elevated by merit and favor. Yet the queen's attention was no gift of generosity. It was an instrument, a reminder that he existed in her world only as long as he remained useful. Isabella's tests were subtle, relentless, and cruelly elegant. She challenged him through cryptic instructions, sudden reversals, and delicate maneuvers that demanded intellect and restraint in equal measure. During a masked ball, she tasked him with intercepting a missive meant for a rival courtier. The act seemed straightforward, yet its failure would have meant immediate disgrace or worse. Lorenzo executed it flawlessly, earning her praise, but the triumph was double-edged. Each success bound him more tightly to her will, a gilded chain he could not see, yet could feel tightening. The court whispered warnings with quiet reverence. The one she favors today, they said, she may destroy tomorrow. Lorenzo had laughed at such talk, confident that understanding the queen's mind would ensure his safety. But favor was a living, shifting entity, and Isabella's desires were mercurial. A gesture out of place, a hesitation, a fleeting doubt any could tip the scales from adoration to ruination. Even in triumph, he felt the subtle invasion of personal expectation. The queen's attention measured loyalty not only in action, but in presence and instinctive alignment with her moods. He navigated a maze where every look, every gesture, every word was scrutinized. The court's eyes never left him. His slightest misalignment could undo months of careful favor. To be chosen by Isabella was to stand naked before a tribunal of shadows, visible and vulnerable. And yet, in all this peril, Lorenzo allowed a spark of pride. Few men in Europe held such proximity to intellect, power and danger intertwined. Secrets whispered in the palace halls, strategies that shaped nations, the queen's inner thoughts, all were his to witness. But beneath pride, unease lurked, for he knew instinctively that the apex of favor often precedes the most devastating fall. Isabella's favor was not generosity, it was a warning, a test, a tether, and ultimately a trap. It elevated and empowered, but it also demanded obedience, presence, and submission. Lorenzo, standing in the brilliance of her attention, had yet to grasp that favor, like all treasures of the court, could turn to ash with a single misstep. Queen Isabella's attention had always been dangerous, a silent predator lurking behind regal smiles and carefully chosen words. For Lorenzo di Falco, what began as favor had shifted into something darker, an obsession that neither flattered nor freed him, but bound him in invisible chains. In the palace, every whisper, every glance, every subtle nod carried significance. To be the queen's focus was to hold the highest reward and the deepest peril simultaneously, a precarious position that left him exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. The corridors of power had never seemed so beautiful and deadly. At first, Lorenzo mistook her intensity for admiration. He had always prided himself on his intelligence, his discretion, his ability to read both people and politics. Isabella noticed these qualities, and more dangerously, seemed to enjoy testing them. She asked questions that appeared trivial, yet revealed layers of intention, forced him to interpret subtleties others overlooked, and watched his reactions with an intensity that left him both honored and unnerved. What was favor became vigilance. What was attention became surveillance. Each meeting, each conversation, felt like a step deeper into her design, a step that could not be retraced without consequence. The queen's obsession manifested in increasingly personal ways. She summoned him for counsel at odd hours, requested observations on the minutest details of court life, and demanded input on matters that seemed beneath both their stations. Every command was a test, a probe into his loyalty and composure. Lorenzo realized that Isabella's eyes were never merely evaluating skill, they measured submission, endurance, and the willingness to be exposed entirely to her gaze. In the court's corridors, whispers spoke of the danger. The one she desires most is the one she may destroy first. His fame as her favorite was a gilded shadow, one he could neither escape nor fully embrace. Even rituals became instruments of scrutiny. Music recitals, masquerades, and staged debates were no longer entertainment, but examinations of his wit, poise, and obedience. Each moment in Isabella's presence left Lorenzo more visible, more vulnerable. The golden favor he once wore like armor now pressed like a shackle, reminding him that proximity to power carried weight far heavier than any crown. Yet he could not extricate himself. The rewards of being indispensable were intoxicating, and the court's envy lent their own silent warnings only partial clarity. He walked corridors that gleamed with luxury, but behind each veil and tapestry waited judgment. Isabella's obsession was not impulsive, it was precise and relentless. One evening, she summoned Lorenzo to the royal library, candlelight casting flickering shadows across ancient manuscripts. She commanded him to read aloud, then abruptly interrogated him on subtle meanings, requiring insight into morality, politics, and poetry simultaneously. A misstep could be fatal in consequence, or subtle in damage, eroding trust he could never fully restore. He realized that the queen's fascination was not affection, it was control, psychological and exacting, designed to ensnare as much as to reward. Each question, each glance, became an instrument to map his limits. Even outside Isabella's immediate gaze, Lorenzo felt the consequences. Courtiers, eunuchs, and servants whispered warnings in hushed tones. The envy that once seemed distant now lingered at every turn, eyes following his movements, ears listening for the slightest deviation. Isabella's obsession cast a shadow over him that extended into every hall, every chamber, every council. To survive, Lorenzo had to balance wit, charm, loyalty, and careful distance, a delicate dance across unseen snares, one misstep away from ruin. The queen's fixation also demanded intimacy beyond protocol. Lorenzo found himself navigating her moods, reading unspoken cues, and anticipating desires that had little to do with governance. Submission, intellect, and composure were all required simultaneously. Even a fleeting hesitation could spark curiosity, delight, or displeasure, each carrying its own unpredictable consequences. Isabella's obsession was a force both seductive and terrifying, a constant pressure reshaping his thoughts, gestures, and very self. He wondered sometimes if her interest in him was merely the pleasure of mastery, or something more twisted, something personal. By the season's end, Lorenzo understood fully that Isabella's attention was not love, not favor, not admiration, it was power. To be the queen's obsession was to walk a knife edge, every act elevated, every misstep punished. His mind and body had become instruments of her desire for control. Survival demanded mastery not only of courtly politics but also of the intricate, perilous architecture of obsession itself. In Isabella's world, obsession was authority, and Lorenzo, once merely favored, now stood as her most prized and most endangered possession. The palace was a theater of silence, each corridor echoing with the hushed fears of those who walked its floors. Lorenzo di Falco had once considered proximity to Queen Isabella a mark of triumph, a golden privilege beyond the reach of most men. Now, that closeness felt like a trap. Every door he passed concealed observation. Every room held both splendor and surveillance. Favor, he realized, came with a cost measured not in gold, but in the surrender of privacy, autonomy, and the quiet certainty of one's own thoughts. Behind closed doors, the line between safety and danger blurred, and power became a suffocating weight. Isabella's private apartments were no ordinary chambers. Walls draped in crimson velvet hid mirrors that reflected every movement, every gesture. Tapestries depicted battles won, allegiances sworn, and victories that demanded obedience. Candles flickered over polished tables, illuminating objects whose beauty masked function, some designed for comfort, others for scrutiny. Lorenzo learned quickly that even a chair, a cushion, a footstool could betray him, if only by revealing posture, tension, or hesitation. There was no neutral space within the queen's domain. All was designed to observe, measure, and record. Her demands became increasingly personal, and the palace corridors were never empty of her gaze. She summoned him for tasks that seemed trivial, then twisted them into examinations of loyalty. A misstep in conversation, a pause too long, or a gesture misaligned could erode trust in subtle, irreparable ways. Lorenzo began to understand that Isabella's obsession was meticulous, crafted to test not just obedience, but psychological endurance. Silence itself became a trial. Speaking carried risk, and inaction could be interpreted as defiance. Every moment behind closed doors was a negotiation with invisible chains. Even ordinary routines became arenas of evaluation. Meals were scrutinized, the manner in which he held utensils, the cadence of his speech, the degree of attentiveness. A simple exchange could be dissected, analyzed, and cited later as evidence of inadequacy. During a particular evening meal, Isabella interrupted him repeatedly, posing questions that demanded both recall and judgment. Correct answers alone were insufficient. Tone, expression, and posture were all assessed. By the end, Lorenzo's mind ached, body tense, yet even exhaustion could not excuse failure. Every glance, every whisper, every step was weighted with consequence. The architecture of privacy itself became a tool of control. Drapes concealed peepholes, mirrors angled into adjoining rooms, and servants acted as hidden eyes, noting every twitch, sigh, and flicker of emotion. Solitude was an illusion. Lorenzo discovered that even when alone, he was never truly unobserved. Each hidden detail of the chambers was a lesson in vigilance. The palace, he realized, was not simply a residence, it was a laboratory, and he, the specimen, subjected to study and refinement under the queen's relentless attention. Tests of endurance multiplied. Hours of conversation, debate, and observation left him drained. Fatigue, Isabella understood, dulled resistance, heightened compliance. Her experiments were never cruel for spectacle's sake. They were deliberate, designed to reshape the mind, condition the body, and expose vulnerabilities. Even the smallest lapse could be a fault line, exploited with precision. Lorenzo's very presence became a measure of power's subtle dominion, a reminder that favor and control were inseparable. Amid scrutiny, he glimpsed moments of humanity, a fleeting laugh, a sigh, a whisper of humor. They were intoxicating, but ephemeral, reminders that behind the palace's grandeur lurked the dangerous machinery of authority. Lorenzo realized that power was enacted not only in councils, edicts, or armies, but in silence, in observation, in the spaces where none dared to intrude. Behind closed doors, the queen's obsession shaped the man he was, and the man he could no longer recognize. To walk the palace was to walk a tightrope of compliance, intellect, and survival of performance whose stakes were absolute. In Isabella's world, privacy was the ultimate illusion. The rooms that appeared lavish were also instruments of dominance. Lorenzo understood, finally, that behind every closed door lay a lesson. Favor was never free, and intimacy with power came at a cost measured in fear, obedience, and relentless self-surveillance. He was the queen's chosen, yet he was also her most scrutinized. A man whose every thought, every breath, every gesture belonged as much to her as to himself. Behind closed doors, he learned the full weight of possession. In the gilded corridors of Queen Isabella's palace, every silk gown hid more than the wearer's body. It concealed ambition, deceit, and deadly intent. Lorenzo di Falco had learned that the court's beauty was a veneer, a tapestry of peril woven with threads of envy and cunning. For every favor he held, there existed a shadow of those who sought to displace him. Women in silk, eunuchs with practiced smiles, and courtiers armed with charm and poison moved in invisible currents, each measuring the golden favor he now carried like a beacon and a target. It began subtly. A glance held too long, a question asked with unintended curiosity, a comment misinterpreted by those craving Isabella's notice. Whispers followed him, curling through the marbled halls like smoke. "The favorite is vulnerable," they murmured. Even the sun casts shadows. Enemies did not always brandish swords. They wielded whispers, rumors, and calculated gestures. A dropped letter, a misdelivered note, even a perfumed handkerchief left intentionally could be turned into evidence of treachery. In Isabella's court, silk was not luxury, it was armor, disguise, and weapon all at once. The women of the court were his deadliest rivals. Each concubine, advisor, or lady-in-waiting possessed knowledge of his habits, fears, and weaknesses, and each wielded these with precision. One evening, during a council gathering, a noblewoman casually mentioned a minor error Lorenzo had made weeks before, a slip in protocol he believed long forgiven. Isabella's eyes flickered, a question unspoken hanging in the air. Though she did not comment, Lorenzo felt the ice of suspicion graze his skin. Every misstep could be magnified into betrayal. The silk-clad courtiers moved like predators, invisible until too late. Enemies in silk were patient. They cultivated smiles, alliances, and confidences, only to strike when opportunity arose. Lorenzo became hyper-aware of every interaction. The tilt of a head, the way a hand rested on a banister, the careful positioning of skirts that could obscure a dagger, a poisoned vial, or a secret missive. Trust once freely given was a liability, and every gesture of kindness carried hidden calculus. Favor painted him in gold and in blood. Even those closest to Isabella could not be counted as allies. Eunuchs traditionally loyal to the crown were instruments of surveillance, their discreet eyes noting every deviation. A servant might offer an innocuous remark, only for it to appear in council as proof of inattentiveness, arrogance, or disloyalty. Lorenzo realized that loyalty in Isabella's palace was never absolute. It was measured by proximity, perception, and the ability to survive the subtle knife of intrigue. The queen herself wielded enemies as instruments of control. She allowed rumors to flourish, observing who repeated them, who hesitated, who navigated treacherous waters with skill. Isabella's genius lay not only in intellect, but in orchestrating fear, desire, and rivalry. Each silk gown, jewel, and positioned courtesan became a node in her network, an extension of her will. To survive, Lorenzo had to master her mind and the machinations of those who moved beneath her shadow. He mirrored their strategies. Observation became instinct. Every smile measured, every word weighed, every gesture calculated. Alliances were forged cautiously. Trust extended only to those whose loyalty was proven repeatedly. Yet enemies in silk had patience, and their strikes were precise. They waited for weakness, any hesitation in thought, speech, or posture to turn favor into downfall. By candlelight, Lorenzo studied palace maps, tracing corridors and chambers where danger might lurk. Every window, balcony, and staircase became a potential stage of treachery. The opulence surrounding him, the tapestries, perfumed halls, and gold-encrusted furniture, was not sanctuary, but a gilded labyrinth. In Isabella's court, silk was both beauty and weapon, favor a fragile shield against those who would destroy him for ambition's sake. Lorenzo understood the stakes. To hold Isabella's attention was to be the brightest star in a night sky crowded with predators. To falter, even once, was to fall prey to enemies in silk, who struck with elegance, precision, and deadly intent. Survival required vigilance, intellect, and a cold understanding that beauty often concealed the sharpest edge. Every favor, glance, and whispered word was a battlefield, and Lorenzo, golden-favored and imperiled, stood at its center. In Isabella's court, flattery was more than courtesy, it was a weapon honed to lethality. Every compliment, every deferential bow, every murmured praise carried a hidden edge. Lorenzo di Falco knew this better than most. Careers rose and crumbled on a misjudged word, a glance held too long, a gesture misread. To navigate the gilded halls safely required both the precision of a surgeon and the cunning of a fox. The court's voices were sugar-coated, yet their sweetness concealed venom. Lorenzo's ascent had been paved with well-timed compliments, careful bows, and judicious acknowledgement of the queen's intellect. Isabella, brilliant and mercilessly perceptive, recognized flattery for what it truly was, a mirror of ambition, a reflection of power. Those who mastered it gained her ear. Those who failed, even inadvertently, risked erasure from favor or worse. Flattery was both bridge and blade. It brought reward, but its sharp edge could cut deeper than any visible wound. The queen's obsession magnified the danger. Lorenzo's words and actions were observed not only by her, but by a network of courtiers eager to interpret, misinterpret, and weaponize them. Compliment the wrong person at the wrong time, and whispers would curl through the palace like poison-laden smoke. He overestimates his station, a maid would murmur. He forgets the sun shines brightest only for those it favors, an advisor would add. Each echo reinforced the precariousness of being the golden favorite. Even Lorenzo's most innocent gestures became tests of judgment. A bow held too long, a tone too familiar, a subtle critique veiled in irony, any could be construed as insolence. He learned to temper speech with the same care he applied to movement, crafting every phrase to please Isabella without inflating his own shadow. Flattery demanded artifice, the illusion of humility, the suggestion of loyalty, the careful balance of intelligence and obedience. Misstep was not a faux pas, it was a threat to life within the palace. Isabella measured flattery like a chemist measures poison. She distinguished false praise from genuine insight, superficial charm from true understanding. Her tests were subtle, a question about a minor policy, a remark on an ambassador's attire, a request for an opinion on a trivial matter. Lorenzo soon realized that even approval could be treacherous. Praise from the queen was never simple. It carried expectation, tether, and a debt that bound him ever tighter to her will. The poison of flattery extended beyond personal interaction. Courtiers, eunuchs, and ladies-in-waiting observed each word, gesture, and compliment. Reports traveled through hidden channels, the careful placement of a phrase, the tone, the visible reaction of the recipient, all scrutinized. Lorenzo was no longer just a target of envy. He had become a subject in the palace's endless study of loyalty, influence, and survival. To endure, Lorenzo cultivated discipline. He flattered strategically, weaving words like silk around intentions, careful never to inflate himself at the queen's expense. Every phrase was calculated to please, every compliment measured for sincerity and humility. He learned to echo her thoughts, anticipate her desires, and appear entirely devoted, without surrendering the smallest fragment of self-respect, though even that, he realized, was perilously fragile. Yet mastery could not shield him entirely. A compliment overheard, a subtle jest misread, or a tone perceived as mockery could undo months of careful cultivation. Lorenzo moved like a shadow, invisible yet ever present, speaking only when necessary, praising only when safe, calculating every nuance of voice, gesture, and expression. Survival required constant vigilance. A single lapse could allow the poison of flattery to seep in, corroding reputation, influence, and life. In Isabella's court, power was as much spoken as seized, as much performed as endured. Flattery, wielded like a weapon, could elevate a man beyond rivals or render him expendable in a heartbeat. Lorenzo, golden-favored and shrewd, understood that his words were not mere politeness, they were armor, shield, and sword. Each phrase could protect or betray, sustain or destroy. The court whispered constantly, the queen watched relentlessly, and the poison of flattery flowed silently through every corridor. To survive in this gilded labyrinth, Lorenzo had no choice but to drink deeply from the poisoned chalice, mastering the delicate art of praise without tasting its lethal sting. In Isabella's world, flattery was never free. Every word carried a cost, every compliment a shadow, every favor a threat. In Isabella's palace, danger was never loud. It arrived in subtle shifts, a narrowed gaze, a hushed whisper, the deliberate misplacement of a letter. Lorenzo di Falco had learned to read these signs with the vigilance of a man walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. Every corridor, every chandeliered hall, and every opulent chamber carried the potential for betrayal. To be favored by the queen was to be exalted and to be marked. Power, he realized, always cast shadows, and in those shadows, peril moved like smoke, invisible yet suffocating. The first signs were often imperceptible. Courtiers who had once smiled now offered polite distance. Letters arrived late, bearing words that seemed innocuous but carried subtle insinuations. Servants, once deferential, began lingering a heartbeat too long near his door, whispering things that were meant to unsettle rather than inform. Lorenzo noticed these details, cataloged them, and learned to interpret the palace as a living organism, each gesture and glance a pulse, each minor disruption a warning of unrest. Danger spoke quietly, but its voice was constant, and the tiniest shift could herald catastrophe. One evening, during a council session, a minor error, a misread dispatch from a neighboring duchy, sparked a ripple of scrutiny. The queen's eyes, always piercing, lingered longer than usual on Lorenzo, and the courtiers around him exchanged almost imperceptible glances. It was subtle enough to escape notice by anyone less observant, but to Lorenzo, it was a signal. The favor he had worn like armor was now a magnet for scrutiny. Even mistakes long forgiven could be weaponized by rivals, and the palace, he understood, was a crucible of such transformations, constantly testing his nerve and resolve. Danger also arrived in whispers. Eunuchs, who had been instruments of loyalty, began repeating snippets of conversations in altered tones. Ladies in waiting offered compliments laced with veiled warnings. "The path of the favored is narrow," a chambermaid murmured once, her words coated with honey and malice. "And the fall is sharp." Lorenzo recognized the truth behind the words immediately. Envy, disguised as advice, rivalry masked as concern. Each utterance was a needle, each smile a trap. In Isabella's court, flattery, gossip, and observation were weapons sharpened daily, and every smile hid the glint of potential betrayal. The signs of danger were not limited to others' actions. They manifested in the queen herself. Isabella's attentions, once warm and measured, shifted towards scrutiny tinged with suspicion. Questions became more pointed, pauses longer, and her gaze, sharp as a hawk's, seemed to probe not only his intellect, but the very loyalty of his soul. Lorenzo could feel the tension tighten around him, an invisible noose formed from expectation, fear, and relentless observation. Favor was no longer a shield. It was a spotlight that illuminated vulnerabilities others would exploit, a constant reminder that his position could evaporate in a single misstep. Even the architecture of the palace seemed to conspire. Shadows elongated unnaturally along tapestried walls. Doorways framed scenes of subtle menace. Hallways echoed with conversations never intended for him, yet somehow always reached his ears. Lorenzo learned to trust instinct over words, to sense the currents of malice before they struck. Danger, he realized, was as much a matter of perception as reality. A whispered doubt could topple an empire of favor as surely as any dagger, and often more efficiently. Despite the constant threat, Lorenzo could not retreat. To step back was to invite suspicion. To falter in observation was to court disaster. He began cataloging every anomaly: a servant's hesitation, a noble's glance, a shift in the queen's tone. Each sign was a map of potential treachery, a warning system calibrated to the subtle machinations of court life. Survival depended not on brute force or visible power, but on anticipation, interpretation, and the ability to act before threat fully materialized. By the season's end, Lorenzo understood that danger was inseparable from favor. To be the queen's chosen was to walk a corridor lined with invisible daggers. Every glance, every word, every gesture became a measure of both trust and peril. In Isabella's court, survival demanded constant vigilance, reading shadows, deciphering whispers, and recognizing threats before they struck. The signs of danger were everywhere, and Lorenzo, golden-favored yet ever precarious, knew he had no choice but to learn their language or fall, swallowed whole by the relentless machinery of court intrigue. The announcement arrived like a thunderclap, though no storm gathered outside. The Edict of Shame, decreed in Isabella's unmistakable hand, came as a sealed parchment, its wax emblem a scarlet promise of humiliation. Lorenzo di Falco felt its weight immediately, long before he broke the seal. In Isabella's court, an edict was never mere bureaucracy, it was a blade, honed to cut reputation, fortune, and dignity simultaneously. The chamber trembled with whispers as courtiers passed the news with careful restraint, fearing even the hint of commentary. The edict named him explicitly. Its language was precise, formal, and merciless, exposing perceived failures and insinuating moral transgressions. Every line was a verdict, the golden favorite now cast into shadow. It did not accuse with vulgarity, but with insinuation that gnawed at character and inflamed envy. Lorenzo's heart pounded as he read the lines, recognizing the layers of intention. Isabella did not merely punish, she manipulated, orchestrating shame as spectacle and instrument of control. The message was clear: no man, however favored, could escape her judgment. The palace corridors became a theater of reaction. Servants who had once shown deference now offered curt nods, as if a kind word might betray him. Noblewomen whispered behind fans, their eyes glinting with satisfaction at a rival's sudden fall. Even the eunuchs, long silent guardians of loyalty, moved with calculated distance, measuring allegiance against the shifting tides of power. Lorenzo realized the edict had done more than humiliate. It had weaponized the court itself. Every observer became a participant in his degradation. Isabella, meanwhile, watched the unfolding consequences with clinical detachment. She summoned Lorenzo, her eyes glinting like sharpened steel. Her calm tone conveyed that the edict was not punishment in the conventional sense, but a lesson, a demonstration of her ability to lift, bind, and sever with the same hand. Lorenzo's mind raced. Every prior favor, every whispered approval, every moment of proximity now carried double meaning. Favor was never simple. Authority, he realized, was spectacle, and he had been both star and victim in her design. The edict's wording suggested moral failing without explicit crime, insinuating disloyalty, indulgence, and ambition beyond measure. Lorenzo understood that in Isabella's court, reputation was currency. and a blemish, however contrived, could bankrupt a man socially and politically. He became acutely aware of eyes watching him, noting posture, expression, and reaction. Even a quiver of emotion could be repeated as evidence of guilt. The edict was not only an instrument of shame, it was a mirror reflecting fears he had not known fully resided within him. The impact extended beyond the palace. Courtiers whispered to visiting envoys, embellishing the edict with dramatic flourish. Letters carried implications to distant estates, planting seeds of doubt among allies. Lorenzo realized Isabella's reach was absolute. Shame, once proclaimed, traveled faster than loyalty could defend. The edict transformed perception into reality. What was insinuation in ink became consensus in action. Survival now required subtlety, foresight, and mastery of machinery that had once elevated him. Even in isolation, consequences were palpable. Dinner conversations became examinations. Walks in the gardens were studies and surveillance. Every gesture required calculation. Every glance demanded strategy. The palace itself, once a place of splendor and security, became a cage built of expectation, fear, and the silent echo of Isabella's decree. Lorenzo's steps, once confident, now trembled like a man navigating a minefield invisible to all but him. By the week's end, the Edict of Shame had achieved its purpose. Lorenzo remained at the Queen's side, yet scrutiny and diminished trust reshaped his existence. To survive Isabella's favor was to endure humiliation as ritual, to accept shame as tool, and to recognize that proximity to power always carried latent threats. He learned, with chilling clarity, that a single parchment could remake a man's fate, and no man, however golden-favored, was safe from deliberate royal cruelty. Favor could raise him to heights unimaginable, but shame, like the Queen's hand, could descend with surgical precision, leaving both reputation and self intact only as illusions. In Isabella's court, power was not merely wielded, it was orchestrated, a symphony of fear, desire, and absolute control. Lorenzo, once untouchable, now understood the cruel artistry of the Edict of Shame. In Isabella's palace, shadows were never merely absence of light. They were repositories of secrets, whispered plots, and truths that dared not meet the sunday. Lorenzo di Falco had learned to navigate them with the wariness of a man who knew the cost of exposure. Every alcove, every darkened corridor, every flicker of candlelight could conceal a message meant for his ears, or a trap meant for his undoing. The court thrived in shadows, and to survive one had to move as silently, as deliberately, as the darkness itself. From the earliest days of his favor, Lorenzo had observed how secrets circulated like blood through the palace veins. A servant with too keen an ear, a chambermaid with a penchant for gossip, an ambassador with hidden intent, each carried pieces of information that could elevate or destroy. He discovered that some secrets were deliberately allowed to surface, bait for the unwary, a test of discretion and judgment. Isabella watched not only for action but for reaction. Every disclosure, every concealment, was catalogued in her relentless memory. To be favored by the Queen was to be exposed to knowledge that could both empower and damn. The palace's architecture itself was a study in concealment. Hidden passageways threaded behind tapestries, false walls concealed listening chambers, and staircases spiraled in patterns designed to confuse casual observers. Lorenzo had traced these passages in private, noting how courtiers moved and misstepped alike. Some secrets were mundane, a misdelivered letter, a misplaced gift, but others were dangerous, capable of undermining careers, alliances, or life itself. Shadows were alive with intent, and he had learned that even the slightest lapse in attention could be fatal. One evening, a muffled argument behind a crimson drape revealed a plot against him. A coalition of courtiers planning to manipulate Isabella's next council decision in their favor. Lorenzo catalogued every word, every hesitation, every subtle intonation. Knowledge, he understood, was both sword and shield, but it demanded precise handling. A single misstep revealing what he knew too early or acting too late could invert the power balance entirely. The shadows offered protection only to those who could interpret their language without faltering. Even the queen's obsession with him extended into these hidden realms. Isabella orchestrated secrets like a conductor, allowing bits of information to reach Lorenzo in cryptic ways. A note slipped into a book, a pause in conversation, a glance laden with suggestion. Each clue was a test, demanding intelligence, prudence, and self-restraint. He began to see the palace as a chessboard, each shadow a square of potential strategy or peril. To survive was to anticipate not only moves but intentions, to read between words, to act only when timing was absolute. The psychological weight was immense. Lorenzo realized that the knowledge he gathered, however vital, was a constant source of tension. Possessing secrets meant holding power, but it also invited scrutiny and envy. Courtiers assumed he knew more than he revealed. Rumors of hidden information circulated, adding layers of suspicion. The shadows, once comforting, became a prison of anticipation, each dark corner a reminder that visibility could be as dangerous as exposure. He was never alone, never unobserved, yet always surrounded by whispers that might guide or betray. Even ordinary moments carried hidden meaning. A servant's lingering gaze, a slight misalignment of a chair, the seemingly casual arrangement of documents all became part of the palace's secret grammar. Lorenzo learned to catalog, to anticipate, and to act subtly. He understood that the shadows themselves could be weaponized, a fact Isabella exploited ruthlessly. The court's secrets were not merely information, they were instruments of obedience, control, and fear. By the season's end, Lorenzo had become a master of the hidden world, reading shadows as others read letters, interpreting intention as others misread courtesy. Yet mastery was precarious. Every secret carried risk, every revelation reward. To survive Isabella's palace, he had to embrace the shadows, to become both hunter and hunted, observer and observed. Secrets were currency, but the price of misjudgment was always life, or honor, or both. In Isabella's court, shadows were never idle. They whispered, they observed, they judged. Lorenzo, once merely favored, now walked the dim corridors as a man who understood that power lived as much in hidden knowledge as in crowns or councils. To thrive, one had to bend with the darkness, respect its silence, and never underestimate its reach. Secrets in the shadows were a perilous inheritance, and he bore them with equal measures of fear and cunning. In Isabella's palace, obedience was never casual. It was ritual, codified in silence, posture, and gesture. Lorenzo di Falco had learned that to be the queen's favored was to be constantly measured, tested, and disciplined. Each day began with exercises of precision, the way he carried himself in council, how he greeted her attendants, even the rhythm of his steps across marble floors. The rituals were subtle, almost imperceptible to outsiders, yet each action carried weight, a hidden ledger of loyalty that Isabella consulted with unwavering attention. The queen's expectations extended beyond protocol. Lorenzo was required to anticipate her desires before they were spoken, to read moods like scripture, to navigate her commands with flawless execution. A misalignment of gaze, a hesitation in speech, even the faintest falter in expression could signal defiance. The palace, once a theater of opulence, had become a disciplined crucible. Lorenzo realized that ritual obedience was more than performance. It was survival. To fail was not merely to displease it, was to invite scrutiny, suspicion, and, in the cruelest cases, ruin. Daily rituals began with audience. Lorenzo approached Isabella with a carefully measured bow, presenting himself with a balance of humility and presence. She observed every detail, the tilt of his chin, the steadiness of his gaze, the cadence of his voice. Each word was an act of devotion, each gesture a demonstration of submission. This was the public layer of obedience, the surface ritual, but behind it lay a far deeper, more perilous layer. Isabella measured the mind as much as the body, probing intelligence, judgment, and restraint under the guise of trivial inquiry or seemingly casual conversation. Even in private, the rituals continued. Lorenzo would be summoned for observation of simple acts, the arrangement of books, the pacing of a walk. the manner in which he accepted or declined refreshment. Every moment, even in solitude, was a test. The Queen's fascination with control was subtle yet absolute, demanding compliance not through overt command, but through psychological rigor. Lorenzo's understanding of these exercises evolved into a precise art. Anticipation, restraint, and careful execution were now second nature. Failure was never explicit, never sudden. Instead, it arrived in subtle reprimands, a flicker of disapproval in Isabella's eyes, a delayed acknowledgement, or the gentle, almost imperceptible withdrawal of attention. Lorenzo had learned that obedience was a constant negotiation between autonomy and subservience, and that the cost of misreading even a single signal could be the erosion of favor or the beginnings of social death. The ritual demanded perfection, not for its own sake, but as a demonstration of complete mastery over self, in service to another's will. The psychological strain was immense. Lorenzo began cataloging patterns, memorizing the sequence of rituals, and learning the intricate rules that governed each. He discovered that rituals reinforced power, conditioning him to anticipate commands before they existed, to act before they were requested, and to maintain composure even as fatigue gnawed at body and mind. The palace itself became an instrument of obedience. Each corridor, chamber, and audience hall designed to test, manipulate, and reinforce the protocols he now followed with near religious devotion. Even acts of kindness or informality were bound by ritual. To smile too freely, to laugh without timing, to speak without precision, each deviation risked the subtle venom of censure. Lorenzo came to understand that obedience was not mere submission. It was a living contract between intellect and body, an unspoken agreement in which every act, gesture, and expression was catalogued and evaluated. To exist in Isabella's favor was to live within these parameters, aware of their weight, and trained to navigate them with absolute care. By season's end, Lorenzo's mastery of ritual was near instinctive. He moved through the palace like a shadow guided by unseen strings, performing every motion with intent, every word with precision. Yet mastery did not lessen fear. It only sharpened it. He understood that Isabella's demands were not static. They evolved, intensified, and adapted. Ritual was not safety. It was vigilance made manifest. The favored must remain ever alert, ever obedient, and ever capable of enduring the relentless discipline of a queen whose will was absolute. In Isabella's court, rituals of obedience were both shield and shackle, preserving life while exacting submission. Lorenzo, golden-favored yet constantly measured, walked the corridors as a man forged by expectation, molded by discipline, and tempered by the terrifying precision of authority. To live under her gaze was to embrace ritual completely, or risk vanishing into shadow, forgotten and undone. Favor, attention, and fear had built an invisible edifice around Lorenzo di Falco, stretching higher with every season in Isabella's court. Yet even the strongest edifices have fault lines, and Lorenzo felt the first tremors of collapse within himself. The rituals, the flattery, the endless surveillance all pressed against his mind and body like a weight he could neither shed nor resist. The breaking point, he realized, was approaching, quiet and inexorable, as silent as the shadows that stalked the palace corridors. It began with small lapses. Lorenzo noticed tremors in his hands, brief stutters in speech, and fatigue that no rest could dispel. Isabella's scrutiny had intensified, subtle shifts in tone sharpening into piercing evaluation. Even the previously manageable rituals of obedience now seemed labyrinthine, each motion a test of endurance. He felt as if the palace itself conspired against him, corridors narrowing, candles flickering to exaggerate shadows, and whispers following him like persistent specters. The courtiers sensed the strain, even as they masked their ambitions. Smiles that once greeted him warmly became measured. Compliments, loaded with insinuation, pricked like needles beneath his skin. Enemies in silk observed each falter, timing a fall. Lorenzo's awareness heightened, but every additional calculation drained the reserves of patience that had previously kept him afloat. His mind teetered between hypervigilance and exhaustion, a balance threatening to tip into ruin. Even Isabella's attention became a double-edged force. Her obsession, once intoxicating, now suffocated. She demanded perfection at every turn, in council, in private, in silence. Her gaze probed for cracks in loyalty, intellect, and willpower, a relentless examination without end. Each misstep or the suspicion of one could provoke subtle censure or public embarrassment. The favored, Lorenzo, understood, was a target not because of malice, but because favor itself created pressure, a machine designed to test endurance to the limits of human capacity. One evening, in the privacy of the Queen's library, the breaking point revealed itself fully. Isabella questioned him on a diplomatic matter with layers of subtext: loyalty of allies, perception of rivals, repercussions of past decisions. Lorenzo's mind, overtaxed from constant scrutiny, stumbled. His words, precise for years, faltered. A pause, a hesitation was all it took. The Queen's eyes sharpened, silence stretched. The room, once sanctuary, transformed into a tribunal. Even without punishment, her attention pressed like iron, a reminder that endurance was not optional. Fatigue, fear, and tension converged. Lorenzo's body ached from hours of posturing, walking corridors, attending councils, and enduring observation. Sleep became impossible. Dreams themselves had become rehearsals of obedience. The line between vigilance and obsession blurred. He realized he was not merely surviving the Queen's gaze, he was consumed by it. Every thought, every gesture, every heartbeat was calibrated to the rhythms of her scrutiny. Yet the awareness of impending collapse only intensified the pressure. The breaking point was not sudden, it was a slow, inexorable erosion. It arrived in tremors of the body, faltering words, and a tightening in the chest. Lorenzo understood that no mastery of ritual, no careful flattery, no anticipation of desire could shield him forever. The palace's architecture, the courtier's cunning, and Isabella's precision had conspired to stretch his limits. To falter was human. To survive required superhuman vigilance. Now, human frailty was all that remained in question. By candlelight, as he reviewed letters and documents in a chamber lined with tapestries of obedience and conquest, Lorenzo recognized the truth. The breaking point was inevitable and intimate. Even golden favor could not exempt him from the frailty of body and mind. Survival demanded acknowledgement of weakness, even as he concealed it. The favored man was measured not by triumph alone, but by the ability to endure the unbearable. In Isabella's court, the breaking point was a constant specter, a shadow that accompanied every favor, every compliment, every glance. Lorenzo, once elevated, now faced it directly, knowing the edge between control and collapse was thinner than the finest silk. He had survived intrigues, flattery, and obsession, but endurance had limits. The favored were fragile, measured, and endlessly tested. And as the palace's shadows lengthened, Lorenzo di Falco understood the breaking point had arrived not in action, but in the quiet, relentless pressure of a queen's absolute attention. The night arrived cloaked in an oppressive darkness, the moon a thin crescent over Isabella's palace, casting long, skeletal shadows across marble floors. Lorenzo di Falco moved with cautious steps, each footfall muted by polished stone. The corridors, normally glittering with candlelight and tapestries, now seemed hostile, transformed into avenues of menace. Whispers of conspiracy, always present in the court, thickened with tension. Tonight was different. Tonight, the threat was not abstract. It was tangible, sharpened like the blade that awaited him. Lorenzo had learned to read the signs. Courtiers who normally smiled now glanced too long at him. Servants carried trays with the weight of calculation, and the hush in the hallways suggested that even the walls themselves had ears. Isabella's obsession with control extended beyond observation. It manifested in deliberate acts designed to test the very limits of loyalty and courage. Something had shifted. The Queen, normally a measured architect of intrigue, had orchestrated a drama whose stakes were life itself. The blade came not as a scream, but as a subtle presence, a glint in the torchlight, the whisper of steel across stone, the cold promise of finality. Lorenzo sensed it before he saw it. A predator stalking within the palace's labyrinthine heart. He moved instinctively, guided by the years of vigilance that had once elevated him above danger. Yet instinct alone was insufficient. He was not merely evading a weapon, but navigating a night designed to measure obedience, fear, and endurance. Through hidden passages and corridors, lined with tapestries depicting conquest and submission, Lorenzo pressed on. Every shadow seemed to pulse with anticipation. Every creak of the floorboard, every draft of cold air felt like a signal of intent. He realized the night itself was weaponized, a theater in which the favored could become prey. Isabella's influence stretched through servants and guards, each a piece of the intricate design. He could not know who acted on their own, or who moved at her silent command. The first confrontation was abrupt, as inevitable as it was silent. A figure emerged from the shadows, blade catching the faint torchlight. Lorenzo's heart hammered not with fear alone, but with a calculated recognition of the ritual at play. Survival depended not on strength but on perception, on reading the subtle currents of movement and intent. Every flick of the wrist, every step, every pause carried meaning, and he responded with precision honed by months under the Queen's relentless attention. Steel sang in the corridors, a metallic whisper of violence barely audible over the pounding of his pulse. Lorenzo parried, deflected, and sidestepped with a dancer's grace, each movement a negotiation with death. The assailant was skilled, deliberate, trained. This was no random attack but a performance of power, an enactment of Isabella's will. The favored, he understood, was a canvas upon which the Queen painted lessons in fear, obedience, and the cost of intimacy with power. Moments stretched interminably, the blade glinting, shadows dancing, and the corridors alive with tension. Lorenzo felt the weight of every decision: when to strike, when to retreat, when to feint. Survival demanded that he act without hesitation, that he anticipate not only the movements of the assailant, but the unseen forces orchestrating the night. His mind, fatigued yet razor-sharp, traced patterns, predicted angles, and calculated the path of each potential wound. The favored had been elevated above all rivals, but now elevation meant exposure. Prominence made him a target. Finally, through a combination of skill, intuition, and luck, Lorenzo disarmed his attacker, sending the blade clattering across the marble. He did not celebrate. The danger had been a test, not an accident. The corridors were still alive with eyes, and he knew the Queen's gaze had followed every motion. Isabella's lesson was clear. The favored could rise above intrigue, endure observation, and master flattery. But the night itself was a reminder of mortality. Power was never merely bestowed, it was enforced with precise cruelty. By the time Lorenzo returned to the private chambers, heart still hammering, he understood the full extent of the ordeal. The Night of the Blade had been both literal and symbolic, a performance of control, a demonstration of the fragility beneath favor, and a chilling reminder that Isabella's power extended to life and death alike. The golden favor that had elevated him was inseparable from the peril it entailed. And in that cold, quiet aftermath, Lorenzo realized that survival in the Queen's court demanded mastery not just of politics, obedience, and perception, but of fear itself, ever present, ever sharpened, and as lethal as any steel. The palace felt smaller after the Night of the Blade, corridors narrower, shadows heavier, and the air thick with tension that refused to lift. Lorenzo di Falco moved through familiar halls with a caution he had never known before. The danger, once immediate and tangible, had passed, yet its mark lingered. Survival had been achieved, but at what cost? Every glance, every whisper, every gesture now carried the weight of memory, a reminder that favor and peril were inseparable in Isabella's court. Even the golden favor he once bore proudly now felt like chains, binding him to expectations he could barely meet. The aftermath was not merely physical. Lorenzo felt nerves stretched taut, a hum beneath his skin that no rest could soothe. Sleep brought fractured dreams, endless corridors, blades glinting from unexpected angles, and the Queen's eyes sharp, unyielding, tracking him even in imagined privacy. Endurance in Isabella's court was never measured by surviving a single night. It was continuous, a slow erosion of certainty, a subtle reshaping of thought, instinct, and resolve. Every gesture he made, even alone, became rehearsal for potential scrutiny, a test he could not escape. Courtiers absorbed the night's events with careful discretion. Whispers circulated, measured and cautious, discussing the favored man's brush with death, without daring to assign blame. Lorenzo immediately understood that observation had intensified. Eyes that once scanned for minor mistakes now catalogued his composure under duress. The golden favor, once a symbol of privilege, had become a prism, refracting danger, admiration, and envy in equal measure. Every smile offered to him now contained calculations, every nod, a question. Even Isabella seemed altered, though subtly. She greeted him with her usual composure, yet her eyes flickered with satisfaction, a silent acknowledgement of a test endured. Praise, once warm and measured, now carried undertones of expectation. Survival was not an endpoint. It was a contract renewed daily. Her control extended beyond words or decrees, shaping perception, memory, and desire, leaving Lorenzo aware he had passed one trial only to step onto the threshold of countless others. He noticed how the smallest gestures, how he carried himself, the cadence of his speech were now scrutinized more closely than before. The palace itself bore the aftermath. Corridors seemed quieter, but only because the court had absorbed lessons from that night. Guards and servants moved with heightened attentiveness. Shadows lingered in corners where they had not before. Even tapestries, depicting conquest and loyalty, now read as silent reminders of mortality and vigilance. Lorenzo walked in a world where every object, every shadow, and every whispered word carried consequence. The air itself seemed charged, heavy, with the residue of fear and cunning, and he felt it pressing upon him at every turn. Isolation followed naturally. Though he had survived, Lorenzo trusted no one entirely. Allies were scarce. Smiles carried duplicity. Gestures of support could conceal a strike. Even proximity to the queen remained perilous. Favor had sharpened, demanding vigilance, awareness, and obedience. Survival reinforced the harsh rules of Isabella's court. Power and danger were inseparable, and intimacy with authority was measured in endurance and subtle mastery. Every encounter became a negotiation. Every word weighed, every silence analyzed. Amid the tension, Lorenzo discovered grim clarity. The Knight of the Blade had revealed not merely the perils of favor, but the boundaries of his own endurance. He had withstood scrutiny, threat, and expectation, emerging unscathed yet transformed. Each nerve, instinct, and learned gesture had been honed not by choice but by necessity. The aftermath reflected both vulnerability and the resilience forged in proximity to absolute power. He understood that the cost of survival was eternal vigilance, and that even a moment's lapse could undo everything he had endured. By candlelight, Lorenzo contemplated the lessons etched into his mind and body. Favor elevated him, but demanded vigilance. Survival was never passive, only earned through calculation, endurance, and subtlety. Isabella's world was a crucible. Those who appeared strongest were tested hardest, and survivors carried scars and insight alike. In the quiet aftermath, the palace remained opulent and dangerous. But Lorenzo was irrevocably altered, sharpened by fear, tempered by the night, aware that survival was only the first trial. The favored man was never free. Each step required caution. Each smile and nod carried weight. Each breath was both victory and submission. The aftermath of the blade was more than a memory. It was a blueprint for the endless negotiation with authority, mortality, and self. Lorenzo had survived, but in Isabella's court, survival was never absolute, and the cost of favor was measured in vigilance, fear, and mastery of one's own shadow. The palace at night was no sanctuary. Shadows stretched like fingers along marble corridors, and every whisper carried intent. Lorenzo di Falco moved carefully, aware that at any moment, favor could turn to death. Isabella's court had taught him the cruel arithmetic of power. Proximity brought reward, attention brought peril, and a single misstep could unmake a man. Survival was no longer a choice. It was a continuous negotiation with invisible forces, each gesture a statement, each breath a calculated risk. Even the air seemed complicit in danger. Candles flickered, exaggerating the long silhouettes of statues. Tapestries depicting conquest now felt like sentinels, watching for hesitation. Courtiers moved silently, their smiles thin and measured, their eyes calculating. Lorenzo had long learned to read these signs, the subtle tilt of a head, the lingering glance, the half-uttered phrase, each could conceal a trap. The rules were constant: anticipate, interpret, act, or be undone. In Isabella's court, survival demanded a mind sharper than any blade, reflexes quicker than envy, and courage tempered with cunning. The first hours of night were the most dangerous. Servants and eunuchs, long trusted as extensions of the queen's will, could relay words, actions, even thoughts. Doors were not just entrances, but barriers to observation, each opening a potential betrayal. Lorenzo moved with practiced care, feet light, breath controlled, thoughts cataloging every angle of approach, every possible interloper. His senses were stretched taut. The palace itself seemed alive, a predator stalking its favored prey. Danger was never obvious, it was always subtle, woven into routine. A misdelivered letter, a delayed summons, a whispered compliment with malicious undertones. Each could prove lethal. Lorenzo had become an expert in interpretation, parsing intent from hesitation, threat from nuance. His survival depended on mastery of courtly subterfuge, as much as on any skill of diplomacy or combat. To fail was unthinkable. To falter meant erasure, public disgrace, or worse. The favored man, he understood, was never untouchable, only constantly vigilant. Even Isabella herself became a measure of peril. Her attention, once intoxicating, now resembled a scalpel, dissecting his loyalty, intellect, and endurance. A single misjudged expression, a delayed response, a hint of fatigue could ignite scrutiny. Lorenzo's mind worked relentlessly, rehearsing every conversation, every gesture, every possible contingency. Favor, he realized, was a double-edged sword. It elevated, protected, and yet exposed him entirely. In the court of Isabella, survival was a performance, perfected through observation, calculation, and the constant suppression of human weakness. The architecture of power compounded the risk. Corridors twisted, staircases intersected, doors led to unexpected chambers, all designed to keep the court and its favored in a perpetual state of alert. Shadows held secrets, corners concealed watchers, even tapestries could obscure silent eyes. Lorenzo had mapped the palace in his mind, noting every vantage, every potential breach. Survival was spatial as much as it was political, a matter of anticipating unseen threats and outmaneuvering them without ever revealing his hand. Yet, amidst the constant threat, there were fleeting moments of clarity. Lorenzo understood the paradox. To survive, one must appear compliant while remaining unbroken, to be present yet elusive, to obey yet remain untethered. Each interaction, each whispered conversation, became a test of equilibrium between visibility and invisibility, power and vulnerability, life and death. In this gilded crucible, the favored learned that survival was not granted, it was claimed. Every moment, with intellect and nerve. By the time the night reached its darkest hour, Lorenzo felt both exhaustion and heightened awareness. Every step, every breath, every calculated gesture had been measured. He had endured scrutiny, navigated invisible snares, and survived not because fortune had smiled, but because he had mastered the lethal dance Isabella demanded. Survival and death were intertwined, inseparable in a court where favor was a weapon, attention a trial, and the slightest lapse could prove fatal. In Isabella's palace, there was no rest, no reprieve, no absolute safety. Survival was constant vigilance, perpetual calculation, and the quiet mastery of fear. Lorenzo di Falco understood fully now. To live was to endure was to obey, and to obey was to navigate the razor's edge between existence and annihilation. Every moment in the Queen's shadow was a choice: survival or death, and the favored man could claim neither lightly, only with relentless precision. Time in Isabella's palace moved differently, measured not by hours or candles, but by the secrets it buried. Lorenzo di Falco had come to understand this brutal calculus. Every favor, every glance, every whispered conversation left traces, some immediately visible, others hidden beneath layers of etiquette, ambition, and fear. And in the shadows, those forgotten or concealed truths accumulated, forming a lattice of danger that could collapse without warning. Survival was not only about vigilance in the present, it required a historian's eye, tracing the echoes of deeds long past. The most perilous secrets were those that seemed innocuous. A misremembered favor, a fleeting jest, or a decision made in haste could resurface decades later, transformed by memory, rumor, or malice. Lorenzo had witnessed it, courtiers quietly cataloging moments, storing them for future leverage, crafting dossiers invisible to the untrained eye. Each act of loyalty or deception was recorded in a web he could never fully see, threads stretching backward and forward through time. The palace itself became a repository of memory and menace, where every corridor held histories unspoken, every chamber echoed with choices once thought private. Even Isabella's own machinations were layered in temporality. She did not act on every slight, nor punish every error immediately. Instead, she allowed secrets to linger, cultivating suspense, uncertainty, and fear. One misstep might pass unnoticed today, only to return months or years later in the form of a subtle test or an orchestrated humiliation. Lorenzo understood that in her world, power was cumulative. Yesterday's favors and failures shaped today's scrutiny, and the past could never be entirely disentangled from the present. To navigate the court was to carry the weight of remembered actions, both one's own and those of others. The Queen's obsession with control extended across time as well as space. Letters from distant provinces, reports of minor disputes, even records of past ceremonies could be summoned to evaluate a courtier's loyalty. Lorenzo learned to track his own history meticulously, cataloging interactions, alliances, and minor offenses, as though compiling a ledger against the inevitable future. Knowledge became armor, ignorance a liability. The past was not merely remembered, it was weaponized. In Isabella's palace, even absence was scrutinized, silence examined, and forgotten gestures could re-emerge as instruments of influence or evidence of weakness. Secrets, Lorenzo realized, were also the currency of survival. Allies held them, enemies exploited them, and the Queen manipulated them with unparalleled precision. The favored man could not rely solely on intellect or charm. He had to cultivate memory, anticipate revelation, and weigh every disclosure carefully. A misplaced confession could haunt him for seasons. A half-truth could bind him in chains invisible yet unbreakable. In this court, the shadows were not empty. They were filled with the accumulated weight of unspoken knowledge, each secret a potential dagger poised to strike at the opportune moment. And yet, the passage of time offered opportunity as well as peril. Patience became a strategy. Enduring scrutiny, withholding reaction, and observing patterns could allow the clever to convert buried knowledge into advantage. Lorenzo had begun to see the rhythm of secrecy, which whispers would fade, which grudges would linger, which confidences might return to serve his own survival. Time did not erase danger, it transformed it, presenting both threats and openings to those who could read its cadence with skill. By the season's end, Lorenzo understood that to be favored was to be ensnared not only in the present, but in the enduring architecture of the past. Every glance, every word, every action might be recorded, remembered, and repurposed. Secrets were both chains and shields, weapons and armor. The palace was a living archive, and those who survived its pressures did so by mastering the passage of time itself, by tracing the invisible threads that connected past, present, and future in a tapestry of power, fear, and ambition. In Isabella's court, the favored man was never free from history. Lorenzo di Falco realized that survival demanded not just attention to the moment, but vigilance across years, a constant reckoning with both what had been done and what had been left undone. Secrets buried by time were never truly lost. They were simply waiting, patiently, for the moment to re-emerge. And in that resurgence, they held the power to destroy or elevate, depending on the skill, timing, and endurance of the one who had learned to live in the shadows. Favor in Isabella's court was never free. Lorenzo di Falco had learned this lesson with every whispered command, every scrutinizing glance, and every perilous test that the queen devised. To be favored was to be elevated above peers, granted privileges invisible to outsiders, yet it came with a hidden toll measured in vigilance, obedience, and the slow erosion of self. Every reward carried weight, every compliment shadow, every opportunity a trap disguised as grace. The cost was cumulative. Months and years of favor had reshaped Lorenzo's thoughts, instincts, and body. Sleep became fragmented, his mind a ledger of gestures, expressions, and unspoken warnings. Even laughter required calculation, each bow or tilt of the head a conscious negotiation between humility and assertiveness. Isabella's attention, intoxicating yet suffocating, was a crucible in which every courtier's limits were tested. Lorenzo realized that the higher one rose in her esteem, the sharper the edges became, the stakes escalating in a pattern both seductive and terrifying. Mistakes were never excused. Minor errors in protocol, slight hesitations, or misjudged remarks were not merely noted, they were weaponized. The favored man could be exalted one day and undermined the next, all orchestrated with an almost surgical precision. Lorenzo had witnessed colleagues fall not to open betrayal but to the slow, deliberate manipulation of circumstance. Favor, he understood, was both sword and shackle. It opened doors, but bound those who entered to unyielding rules, invisible yet inescapable. Isolation was another price. Proximity to the queen drew envy, suspicion, and resentment. Courtiers whispered behind fans. Servants measured intentions, and even trusted allies became instruments of subtle surveillance. Lorenzo learned that intimacy with power required solitude. To speak freely was dangerous, to trust deeply even more so. Every alliance was provisional, every friendship conditional. To maintain favor, he had to move like a shadow, balancing visibility with discretion, charm with restraint, loyalty with cunning. The psychological toll was relentless. Isabella's gaze, once a source of validation, became a constant instrument of measurement. Lorenzo's thoughts, gestures, and reactions were always under review. Sleep, leisure, and even private reflection were contaminated by the awareness that any lapse could be transformed into evidence of weakness. Endurance became a skill, vigilance a necessity, and composure the only armor against the corrosive power of observation. Favor was both blessing and burden, gift and guillotine, offered with the same hand that could revoke it without warning. Yet reward and peril were inseparable. Access to the queen's counsel, proximity to power, and the ability to influence decisions were intoxicating. Lorenzo could shape policy, witness history, and achieve feats unimaginable to those outside her favor. Each triumph came at a cost, and each victory deepened dependence on Isabella's will. The price of favor was paradoxical. The higher one soared, the more one owed, and the more tightly one was bound to the invisible strings of control. By the season's end, Lorenzo understood the full calculus. Favor was not merely privilege, it was a continuous negotiation between desire, fear, and survival. Every smile, every nod, every whispered suggestion carried weight. Every step forward required careful navigation. Isabella's court functioned like a living mechanism. Loyalty, ambition, envy, and skill meshed into a system in which each participant was measured, tested, and refined. The favored man was both instrument and participant, elevated yet perpetually imperiled. Lorenzo's reflection was stark. To be golden favored was to exist in a state of constant tension, to wield influence while shouldering vulnerability, to bask in opportunity while aware of its latent dangers. Power and peril were inseparable, intimacy and isolation intertwined, and trust always provisional. In Isabella's world, favor was the most exquisite and the most dangerous form of currency, its cost invisible until too late to retreat. The price of favor, Lorenzo realized, was eternal vigilance. It demanded intellect, courage, charm, and endurance, all calibrated to survive the delicate, relentless scrutiny of a queen who measured loyalty as carefully as she dispensed reward. To live under her gaze was to walk a razor's edge, where every act elevated or imperiled, and every heartbeat was a measure of survival. And as the palace's shadows lengthened, Lorenzo di Falco understood the ultimate truth. Favor was never merely a gift, it was a contract written in invisible ink, binding body, mind, and soul to a queen's will, with consequences that could neither be escaped nor undone.